Stand by, Michael's mic. 3, 2, 1, roll A. Tracks my cue dissolve.
There's been more bloodshed in Syria. Witnesses say at least 24 people were killed in Syria on Friday during anti-government demonstrations. More demonstrations. Sources inside the country tell CNN that some of those killed were trying to march to the city of Dara. You see it there near the Jordanian border. That's where protesters initially began demanding reforms more than a week ago. Now, sources also say other people died when security forces fired on protesters in Dara's main square. Demonstrations took place even though the government announced a series of reforms, salary increases, tax cuts, that sort of thing, on Thursday. Meanwhile, Syrian state television airing pro-government rallies. In some of the footage, the crowd is heard chanting, "With our blood and our souls, we defend you, Bashar," referring to Bashar al-Assad, the president. Now, CNN, of course, is unable to confirm a lot of what we're getting out of Syria independently, and that's because the government so far has not granted us permission to go inside the country and report from there. But Al-Hala Garani has spent a lot of time in Syria over the years. She knows the country very well and has been following events closely. I had a chat with her earlier. Who better to talk to about Syria? Somebody who's been there a lot. Hala, let's talk a little bit about the current situation as you saw developments today and you were anchoring on your show. How do you see things at the moment?
Well, it was interesting today that we saw protests in other cities outside of the southern province of Dara, outside of that city of Dara, where deaths were reported, at least 15, probably more, because this comes a day after the government spokeswoman or the spokesperson and presidential advisor, Bithena Shaban, promised reforms, said that some of the grievances of the people of Dara were justified. Despite that, we saw continued protests, and that is significant.
And these were protests after the funerals, was it?
Yeah, it was. And you know, in the Middle East, Friday prayers, people are together. It's an opportunity for people to congregate, and that's when we see a lot of these political demonstrations.
I was saying funerals because that's something that happens with these crackdowns, isn't it? They crack down, people get killed, there's funerals, more people come to that, it becomes another demonstration. That can get a roll on, can't it?
And add to the funeral procession the fact that it's Friday and people go to mosques in droves, so you have that as well. I do find it significant, we were speaking with some of our executive producers and people who've been following the story, I do find it significant that we've also seen protests in Damascus, small, but they were there nonetheless, and in Hama. And you know the significance of Hama. In 1982, the father of the current president, Hafiz al-Assad, cracked down very hard on a Muslim Brotherhood opposition there and killed tens of thousands. So that's very significant.
Yeah. Now, as a country, you've been there a lot. What can you tell us about the country and the people? You know the place, and I've never been there.
Yeah, well, you know, it's different from Egypt. It's different from Libya. It's got its own particularities. It doesn't have a culture of protest. It certainly doesn't have a culture of open public criticism of the government. That's why what's happening now in Syria is all the more significant, because even before the uprising in Egypt, you still saw protests. You'll remember when these legislative elections happened and you saw people come out on the street and there were scuffles with security forces. So it exists in the collective consciousness of Egyptians in a way it doesn't exist with Syrians.
Never in Syria. Life there hard for the average Syrian, or is it life pleasant enough?
Listen, there is not the level of poverty that you see in some parts of Egypt. The big frustration for people in Syria is corruption. It's that economic opportunity almost systematically goes to people tied with the power, with the leadership and the power structure. In other words, you might have a 24-year-old engineering graduate who's worked hard, who's studied, who now has a diploma and absolutely no opportunity for employment in his or her own country. They have to go to the Gulf countries or to the West.
That is a common thread, though, in some of the other countries where we've seen uprisings, and that is that lack of opportunity, combined with other things. But it is important, as you say, it's very easy to say there's upheaval in the Middle East, but they're individual countries with their own sets of issues.
There's one thing that I don't think we've brought up enough, and that is some people in Syria differentiate between the Assad couple themselves, so Bashar and his wife Asma, you know, Western, kind of glamorous. She actually had a controversial Vogue profile appear a few weeks ago. And the regime itself, they're not entirely unpopular as a presidential couple.
Right.
So people have to also be very careful when they say the protesters want those two gone, you know, versus the system to change. I think some want them gone, but I don't think everyone wants them gone. And I think some want radical change, others want change within the existing framework because they're concerned there might be instability. So it's important to differentiate and to nuance this story.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, and I know you've got to do a cut in a minute, so we'll
3
finish it off.
Yeah.
We'll finish it off quickly. It's interesting that these protests, when they started, were against corruption and wanting change, but not wanting overthrow or regime change.
Well, they've gone very anti-regime since demonstrators were shot in the streets of Dara. We've all seen these YouTube videos of demonstrators. We've seen bullet holes in the heads, and we've seen clearly security forces take aim to shoot to kill the demonstrators. When you're burying your brother, your husband, your son, you know, you might have protested against corruption the day before, but today you're protesting for the regime to go down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You better go.
I gotta go. All right.
She's got to go on air.